Hi, I'm Yaakov Katz, and welcome back to the Jewish People's Podcast by JPPI, where we break down the stories shaping Israel and the Jewish world. Today, Israel finds itself at yet another critical crossroad. The ceasefire in Gaza has collapsed, the war has reignited with deadly force, and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu vows to escalate Israel's military campaign against Hamas. At the same time, tensions are boiling over across the country. Massive protests have erupted, a growing movement that's demanding answers about the fate of the hostages and accusing the government of putting politics above the national interest. And if that weren't enough, earlier this week, Netanyahu announced the sudden dismissal of Ronen Bar, head of the Shin Bet, Israel's internal security service, a move seen by many as politically charged and potentially destabilizing. To help us make sense of all this, we have a conversation today with Anshel Pfeffer, Israel correspondent for The Economist, a former long-term reporter for Haaretz, and the author of Bibi, the definitive biography of Prime Minister Netanyahu. We'll talk about what led to the breakdown of the ceasefire, the real story behind the Shin Bet's chiefs firing, how Itamar Ben-Gvir has returned into the government, and how all this fits into Netanyahu's long-term survival strategy. Anshel's reporting brings us deep into the heart of the Prime Minister and Israeli decision-making. You won't want to miss his insights. Anshel Pfeffer, it's great to have you on the podcast. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Yaakov. Always a pleasure.
So lots to talk about, and I want to start with kind of how the week began, because since then, much has changed here, and I'm guessing it's all kind of connected. But now, after Israel is back again attacking in Gaza, we have a resumed offensive, for now at least, from the air. Might include some ground option, might not. Small little incursion as we're recording this today on Wednesday, but we don't know exactly where this is headed. For the time being, Israel's saying this is about putting pressure on Hamas to get back the hostages, to get at least a better deal from Hamas for the hostages. But the week began with the intention, or at least the declared intention by our prime minister, to dismiss Ronen Bar, the head of the Shin Bet, the Israel security agency. And then it seems that everything has kind of spiraled since then. I mean, should we be looking at everything that's happening through this prism of Netanyahu's political agenda, which includes removing Ronen Bar, intended declaration to remove Gali Bar of Miara, the Attorney General, Itamar Ben-Gvir coming back into the government now? Or should we leave the politics aside and focus on the substance, which is the hostages and putting pressure on Hamas? Or can we not disengage one from the other? How are we meant to see all this?
Well, I think we've been living in Israel now for a period which we know exactly when it began, at the end of 22, when Netanyahu returned to office, where the lines which are defining our national life, politics, policy, security, diplomacy, everything, social policies which don't really exist anymore in this country, have all been defined by one issue, and that is Netanyahu giving away power to be in office. Now, there's a famous saying by a British politician who once accused the British government of being in office and not in power. And this is very clear in Netanyahu's situation since he returned to office. He gave away power. He gave away power to his coalition allies and even to some parts of Likud, which he doesn't control. In the same, I mean, he controls Likud, but there are actors within Likud who are beyond his control, and he needs all these allies so he can wake up in the morning and look himself in the mirror when he shaves and say, "I'm the Prime Minister of Israel," and then he goes into the prime ministerial car and convoy and goes to the Prime Minister's office. And he sits there, a number of prime ministers' offices, the big one in Jerusalem, the small one in the Knesset, the one in Tel Aviv, and some various other places where the prime minister may be sitting. And and now he also has a plane, which makes him kind of special amongst previous prime ministers. So there are all these trappings of office, but the price of office for him to remain in office, to have the majority in the Knesset which keep him in office, is basically that he has given up almost all of the powers that he has. And because this is also, we're talking here about Netanyahu, who even when he was more powerful, was always someone, was and it remains a notorious procrastinator, someone who's terrible at making decisions. Nearly every major decision and many small decisions which have been made by the government in the last 2 years and now, 3 months almost, have been either because of the pressures or basically the decisions of coalition members who are not Netanyahu, or because of events. Netanyahu has been responding to events, and he's changed his slogans over the war. We had victory and then total victory and then nearly total victory. And his most recent slogan is, we've changed the face of the Middle East. Now, obviously, if we analyze, and yes, many things have changed in the Middle East over the last 17 months, Netanyahu hasn't changed the face of the Middle East. This has all been response to things that are happening and things which are happening beyond his control.
Reactive as opposed to initiating.
At best, he's reactive, and at worst, he's doing what his coalition want him to do. And we don't even, obviously we focus more than anything else on the war and things which are related to the war. But let's take something which is totally, well, not totally, but almost totally separate. Economic and social policies. Now we know, you know as well as I do, Netanyahu, it grew up and has always been a small government fiscal conservative. He is now the prime minister of a government which is spending billions and billions on payments to narrow interest communities, which is totally a contradiction of everything he believes in, as someone who does actually have some kind of understanding of macroeconomics. And that kind of has passed without a murmur within his own circles, because this is what he needs to stay in power. He needs to be paying all these billions to ultra-Orthodox parties, to area institutions, to various semi-secret organizations funding things in the settlements. This has nothing to do with his ideology. He has very firm. He believes that he was the man. Obviously, this is totally erroneous, but he believes he's the man who somehow built Israel's economic miracle. Obviously, which is also kind of strange because he's a capitalist and he's taking credit for the private sector. But anyway, that's another of the many contradictions of Netanyahu. But the way in which he has zero control over his government's fiscal policies is just another example of how I think he's the weakest prime minister in Israeli history. Even Naftali Bennett, who was a prime minister for a short while as a leader of a party of 6 Knesset members, I think was more powerful than Netanyahu has been in this government.
But correct me, by the way, I mean, when you're talking about like macroeconomics, I think it might have been you who, maybe I could be wrong, so tell me, it might not have been you, but someone once told me a story of how they were in his office and they took a book about macroeconomics or microeconomics off the shelf. And in the margins, he had his, handwritten notes by Netanyahu of, just how in depth, his intellectual depth and knowledge. He knows what's right, as you're saying. He knows what the right thing is, but he's doing the opposite. And it leads me to the question of, so even if let's take a moment, the return of Ben Gvir to the government now and back to his old office as the Minister of National Security. Ben Gvir had been out for a couple of months ever since the deal was reached with Hamas to get the first stage, the 33 hostages who were returned. Ben Gvir decided to leave the government, now came back because Israel's again bombing in Gaza. But on the one hand, you could say, right, that Israel should be attacking Gaza because we need to put pressure on Hamas because the the Witkoff framework, as it's called, is not moving forward. So it's legitimate. A legitimate tool is to put some military pressure on them. But there's also the political dimension. When you look at it, how are we, the people, supposed to view what this now renewal of hostilities? Is it for political survival, so he can get the budget across the finish line at the end of the month now with Ben Gvir, or is it because it's the right thing to get back the hostages?
Well, there are a number of problems with the way Israel has been conducting this war. And I think, from the broadest perspective, it hasn't been clear what this war is about from the very beginning. I mean, first of all, there's the war objectives. There are three war objectives. There's destroying Hamas's military capabilities. There's ending Hamas's governance over Gaza. And there's freeing the hostages. Obviously, freeing hostages is something that the government added as an afterthought because of public pressure. But those are the three official war aims. Now, you and I have both covered the IDF and military affairs during, for parts of our career. You do not have to be von Clausewitz to understand that these three aims are contradictory. You can't do them at the same time. The type of military operation and doctrine and tactics, and even the type of weapons and types of units that you use for these three different things are different. And trying to carry out these three missions at the same time is a recipe for failure. And we are in a situation when none of these three objectives have been realized in full. And the hostages which have been released. I think 7 hostages were released by various special operations, and the other 190 were released through negotiations. Hamas's governance over Gaza was restored the day that Israel left at the end of the ceasefire, and the military capabilities have certainly been degraded to a very large degree, but they still exist also to a certain degree. And this is after 17 months, until the ceasefire, 15 months of the most intense, the longest Israeli war, the most intense campaign. And it's because there was no clear idea of how to achieve and how to prioritize these objectives, because there hasn't been really any strategic thinking. And what strategic thinking there was, you had different people in the government. You had Gantz and Eisenkot for a certain period, and you had Yoav Gallant until Netanyahu fired him in November, and you had Netanyahu dithering between, just cast your mind back to the very beginning of the war, the first 3 weeks between October 7 and when the ground offensive began, 20 days after October, on the 27th, Netanyahu was the one holding them back from going into Gaza.
He hesitated, as he always does.
He didn't hesitate, he procrastinated. And he was looking for various military experts to give him the justification. He had his meetings with former General Brick. He had meetings with Gabi Ashkenazi, who was saying, nah, it's not going to work, and the IDF will fail to, and so on and so forth. They were wrong, because I think the ways they showed in which the IDF will fail were wrong. But on the other hand, yes, the way that the maneuver is done was inconclusive, and wasn't clear what how to prioritize those three objectives. And then the biggest problem is that there really has been no strategy. Okay, let's say all those three objectives had been realized. Gaza is something that you need to have an idea what you're going to do with it. It's 2 million plus people. It's an area which, as we saw, is so adjacent to Israel and to where Israelis live. You have to have some kind of idea what you're going to have there instead of Hamas, if you do succeed in removing Hamas. That idea has never been, obviously when Donald Trump suddenly blurted out his Gaza Lago idea in the White House, suddenly Netanyahu said, you see, this is our idea. As if Netanyahu was thinking 15 months earlier that, yes, in 15 months, Donald Trump will win the U.S. election, and this is the plan. I mean, that's ridiculous. So the whole strategy of this war was non-existent. There was Netanyahu and Ron Dermer say, we have a strategy, but we can't tell you what it is. And obviously there wasn't any real, there was...
I remember being told by a senior government official that if we tell you what it is, it will ruin chances of being able to do it.
We probably thinking of the same senior government official right now.
Yeah.
And, this magic secret strategy never really existed because Netanyahu doesn't have that kind of strategy. He, at the end of the day, is focused on waking up prime minister and going home at night as prime minister. And it's not that Netanyahu thinks, oh, it's so bad that now my economic policies are totally contradictory to what I believe in. No, Netanyahu convinces himself. There is no, I think, a human being who is so good at convincing themselves of this cognitive dissonance that he has, because it's not just about himself. It's that if I am prime minister of Israel, I mean, it means Israel is on the right track. Basically, Netanyahu's strategy is I should be prime minister, and if I'm prime minister, therefore Israel.
And if I'm not prime minister, Israel's existence is in peril.
It's in immediate peril. It's on the brink.
Immediate,
and that's a strategy. I mean, and Netanyahu was saying that, in the interviews he gave between the election and the inauguration of the coalition at the end of 22. I mean, he wasn't giving interviews to Israelis, obviously, but he gave some interviews to American media. And when they were asking him, oh, but you've got these people like Ben Gvir and Smotrich in your coalition, he said, no, they're joining my government. I'm not joining them. And we've seen over the last 2 years and 3 months exactly how much they joined his government, and he was the one setting policy.
And by the way, Ben Gvir himself, before stepping down from the government, took pride in the fact that he was able to delay and prevent deals from being made.
Prevented the release of hostages. And we know that the two deals in which hostages were released, the November 23, that was Joe Biden together with Benny Gantz, and it was a rare case in which both Biden and Gantz showed some spine and managed to pressure Netanyahu. And he wouldn't have signed the deal without that pressure. And then in January, the deal was signed. It was actually incredibly, it was signed even before Trump was inaugurated, but it was enough for this guy that Bibi had never heard of, Steve Witkoff, to fly over and say, no, you're going to meet me on Shabbat. I know these, don't make this excuse that you keep Shabbat. You can meet me. You'll meet me now, and you'll sign this deal. So in both cases, in both the ceasefires, it only happened because of the insistence and the pressure of others. And in these cases, Ben Gvir and Smotrich tried to prevent it and failed. So what we see here is the prime minister who is making policy on the basis of whatever pressure and whatever events are forcing him into positions.
So let's go back for a moment to Ronen Bar. I mean, how do you understand? Because we've had protests now over the last 2 days in Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, people protesting his dismissal.
As we speak, I can hear it through the window.
Okay, Ronen Bar, at the end of the day, impressive guy, dedicated his life to the security and safety of the state of Israel, failed on October 7th. Although I would argue that to some extent he actually saw some things that other people didn't and tried to take some steps. Doesn't make a difference for the time being. That was in the tactical in the moment, but overall, definitely he took responsibility, said, I will step down. I won't finish my full term. But Bibi has had it out for him now for a while. And earlier this week calls him in for a meeting and says, that's it. I've decided I'm going to dismiss you. I'm going to bring it to a decision to the cabinet. That hasn't all changed because of the renewal of hostilities and fighting in Gaza. So Ronen Bar remains in his job. The attorney general is kind of also putting up some roadblocks and obstacles and saying it's a little more complicated than just the government voting to remove and replace. But what does Bibi have against this guy? I mean, what is it? Because there's his failures. There's the Qatargate so-called investigation. Is there something else? I mean, what is it about the head of a security agency? That's what he is. He's the head of an intelligence organization. I mean, how is he a threat to Netanyahu?
Well, first of all, you mentioned intelligence and security. In some countries, intelligence agencies and security agencies are not necessarily the same.
Right.
And with the Shin Bet, I'm sure you're familiar with the wording of the Shin Bet law. The mandate of the Shin Bet is national security and protecting of Israel's democratic process and institutions. And that is something that the Shin Bet should and I think does under Ronen Bar take quite seriously. So there's this kind of, hold on, we are not necessarily beholden to you. Now, the Shin Bet, like Mossad, like the Atomic Energy Commission, are those highly secret and crucial national security agencies which are answerable to the Prime Minister and not like the IDF, for example, or the police, which are answerable to ministers and then to the cabinet. And we don't have as much as Netanyahu hates to be faced with that, we do not have a commander-in-chief in Israel. There isn't one person who is in charge of all the national security institutions. But yes, the Shin Bet is under the Prime Minister's office. So this puts them in a very intimate situation. They're basically, an Israeli Prime Minister daily engages with the Shin Bet. They may not meet every day, but there are things that the Shin Bet sends for authorization to the Prime Minister nearly every day. There are updates every day. And this is a highly sensitive post. And this is the first time that a Prime Minister is trying to fire the head of the Shin Bet. But if you go back in history, if I'm not mistaken, 4 heads of Shin Bet were sort of forced to resign. I mean, they kind of understood. Carmen Gilon understood after the Rabin assassination, Avraham Shalom after the 300 bus murders, basically. Going further back, with Isidore Roth and other people, it's going back in the deep dark days of the 1950s. So it's not as if this relationship between a Prime Minister and a Shin Bet director was always harmonious. There is a lot of potential for tension in that, and there's a lot of potential for failure. This is someone who's dealing with the most sensitive operations, and sometimes there are failures, and the leader of the organization has to take responsibility. And Ronen Bar, and you're right that the failure of the Shin Bet and of Ronen Bar on October 7 is not exactly black and white. There are things that he did right, and there are things that he did say and warn about in the weeks and months leading up to October 7. Yes, ultimately they failed, and therefore he has taken responsibility. But what has made this different is that Ronen Bar is not just the head of the Shin Bet. He's a member of 2 groups that Netanyahu is trying to purge. One of them is all the heads of law enforcement and legal organizations. And the Shin Bet is not just intelligence security, it's also a law enforcement organization in a way. And as I said, it has a mandate to protect Israel's democracy, not just national security, or it sees the democracy as being part of national security. And Ronen Bar is one of the last, along with Gali Barav Miara, of the senior officials appointed by the short-lived Bennett-Lapid government. And they're all seen as suspect. And well, who is the one person, the one senior official agency head Netanyahu hasn't tried to replace? Dedi Barnea, who was appointed by Netanyahu himself in the previous Netanyahu government. And also, interestingly, Netanyahu's relationship with the Mossad has not always, but along those many years he's been prime minister, he's often had a better relationship with the Mossad than he's had with the IDF and the Shin Bet and the police, of course. So there are many reasons why Netanyahu would be gunning for Ronen Bar. And then you have the additional reason, this is connected to the law enforcement angle, is that the Shin Bet also is in charge of certain types of investigations, which are now, there are 2 of them. And I'm sure you noticed that in Ronen Bar's statement in response to Netanyahu's announcement that he's firing, he said, I have a number of things that I said I took responsibility for what I'm looking at October 7, but there are a number of things that I need to, that I still need to make sure happen before I can leave my post. So there are 4 things there. One is to finish the briefings, the investigation into what went wrong on October 7 to fix things in the agency. The other one is the release of the hostages, and the head of the Shin Bet is a hugely important part of any process in which prisoners are Palestinian prisoners are released in response. Another thing that he mentioned, which is relevant to what we're talking about, to prepare 2 successors for which the Prime Minister can choose among them. And that's the kind of thing, even before Netanyahu fired him, we've been hearing for weeks, and I'm sure you have as well, from people in the security establishment saying that Ronen Bar's biggest worry is that Netanyahu will choose someone from outside the organization, someone who will be convenient for him, and will basically allow him to politicize the
someone who will be a yes man for Netanyahu.
Yeah, so Ronen Bar mentioned in the list of things he still needs to do before he leaves, preparing 2 candidates, and he said the Prime Minister will choose, but I want, and And there's an argument there, because at the end of the day, that's not under law an official part of what the head of Shin Bet could do. The Prime Minister can decide. There is a committee which will afterwards say if this is, there's the senior appointments committee in the civil service which will review that anyway. But there's that, and then he wrote there, what was the wording? Mispar chakirot regishot, a number of sensitive investigations. Now, everybody sees that, and immediately they think of the two investigations which are being run jointly by the Shin Bet and the police. The suspects in both investigations are the same. This circle of advisors around Netanyahu who were involved allegedly, so we have to say allegedly, in leaking those classified documents to a number of international newspapers, and who allegedly received payments from the Qatari government while at the same time they were working for Netanyahu. Now, I don't know what is going to come out of those investigations. I don't know if what comes out of it will necessarily amount to criminal charges. And we're talking here about very sort of a kind of a grey area. But this is obviously something which is driving Netanyahu crazy. We can see by the frequency and the vehemence of the statements that he's come out. He came out with one today as well, denying all these things. It's obviously something that he's extremely worried about, and Ronen Bar is running part of that, along with Gali Bar of Miara. So
in his mind, to some extent, if he removes Ronen Bar and removes Gali Bahar of Miara, the Attorney General, he potentially takes care of the investigations that are now going on among his staff, which could creep up on him. And he has the ability to potentially delay or even maybe dismiss the trial, where he finds himself, let's not forget, twice a week, he needs to appear in the Tel Aviv District Court. This week, he had one of those days he got off because Israel is again attacking in the Gaza Strip. So he got a break from the judges. But he doesn't want that. I mean, and he's afraid also, let's not forget, Anshel, and you know this better than I do, that I think it's in a couple of weeks maybe, or maybe a little more, that the cross-examination will begin for Netanyahu in his trial, right? So he's been giving testimony in the convenience of his attorneys asking him questions, but soon the prosecution will get their turn. That will be a little, you'll be under, what's it called? You'll be under the fire, or under the investigation.
The fire will be under him.
The fire will be under him, yes.
He's certainly not looking forward to the moment that he becomes, that the questioning is handled by the prosecution. And, there's something else which is happening here, and that's the way he's being seen from the White House. Now, Donald Trump is looking at this, and he's saying, what's happening there? And he's not saying, oh, they're terrible, Netanyahu's a hero. He's saying Netanyahu's a weakling. Look what I did. I came in and I immediately replaced every single...
cleaned the deep state, drained the swamp.
And brought in these podcasters to run the FBI. The idea...
Who said there's something wrong with somebody who has a podcast, Anshel? Come on.
I mean, I'm sure that you and I would be perfect as head of Shin Bet and head of Mossad. We could totally make sure that everything works just beautifully. I'm surprised we haven't got the call.
Exactly.
You'll take the Mossad because you like the traveling, and I'll take the Shin Bet because I'm
got it. Okay.
More of a down-to-earth type. But, Trump doesn't understand the niceties of Israeli democracy and the fact that not every system is a presidential system. And I know this from speaking to people in Netanyahu's orbit, that he's worried about Trump thinking of him as being too weak. Trump doesn't admire someone who goes on the stand in the Tel Aviv District Court and shouts at the judges. Trump admires people who get rid of the judges, and that's what happened with Trump. All of Trump's cases have been dropped, if I'm not mistaken. You know more about American politics than I do, but I don't think Trump is due any time in the Manhattan District Court.
No, he's not.
His many alleged sins. So this is something which is really bugging Netanyahu, and he came back from his visit to Washington with a drive to get rid of those of those senior officials in law enforcement still remaining. But as we see, it's not so easy, and he has to make a choice, and he hasn't yet made that choice because, as we've said, he's not good at making difficult choices of whether he is going to take on the Supreme Court full on, because at some point there will be petitions to the Supreme Court. I mean, there have been already, but they were preliminary, so they were dismissed. But if and when the decision, the official decision to remove Ronen Bar is made by the government, and it may be even tonight or tomorrow, if and when this long process of removing an attorney general reaches some kind of definite stage, and they are firing Gadi Barav Miara, then the Supreme Court will take a much more serious look at it. And it won't be surprising if, at least in one of these cases, they'll say this is unreasonable, and the various other arguments the Supreme Court can use to intervene in one of these in these decisions. And then we'll be at the peak of this constitutional crisis that Israel's kind of been heading for from January the 4th, 2023, when Yariv Levin first presented his judicial overhaul plan. And I don't think Netanyahu knows yet what he's going to do at that moment. Whether he's going to say to the Supreme Court, "No, I'm very sorry, I am not accepting one of your rulings." I mean, he was tested very early in this term when it came to the ruling that Aryeh Deri cannot serve as a minister in cabinet.
And he adhered to the decision, correct?
And he adhered to the decision with very bad grace, obviously, but he adhered to the decision. So, at what point, and is there a point where Netanyahu says to his coalition around him is saying, "Go for it"? If the Supreme Court dares to say to you, "Do this and that," then you tell them,
no,
you tell them where they can get off. But Netanyahu, I think, doesn't want to reach that point.
He doesn't want to reach that point because, in deep down, he knows it's wrong, or he's afraid of the repercussions.
He doesn't want to reach that point because he's not that kind of a person. He doesn't like that kind of confrontation. He likes to force people to do what he wants rather than have to. He wanted Gallant to resign. He didn't want Gallant. He didn't want to have to fire Gallant. And the same thing now with Ronen Bar. He wanted Ronen Bar to resign. He didn't want to have to fire. At the end of the day, Herzi Halevi, the now former IDF chief of staff, did what Netanyahu expected him to do, and I think he did the right thing in this case by resigning when he did. I think Netanyahu obviously would have wanted to resign a bit earlier, but that's the favorite outcome. That things work out the way he wants them. He's a status quo guy. He likes to get his way without having to rock the boat. And the question is, what will happen if getting his way will mean having to defy the Supreme Court?
But let me ask you one last question before I let you go. It has to be said that after everything you just told us, politically, it doesn't hurt him. And maybe you could even make the argument to some extent, and I know the people around him are making this argument, stand up, fight these different branches of government and the judiciary, the attorney general. It feeds the base constituency of his and these voters who also have no trust in the attorney general, in the court, in the Shin Bet. So besides the fact that he's breaking down and dismantling any fabric of trust that might have existed, and we all know how important that is in a society, that the people believe in their law enforcement agencies, believe in their military, believe in the media, for example, which is a whole other conversation. I mean, Bibi uses this because it helps him also politically.
Well, that is true until he has to face an election now. He's going to do everything in his power to stay in power until the next election. Who knows, maybe there'll be a state of emergency conveniently in October 2026, and that will somehow allow for a postponement of the election. That's not an outlandish outcome. But yes, it works as long as your political tactic is based on your base, and your base in this case is a minority of Israelis. It's not. We haven't seen any poll basically since the moment Netanyahu appointed Ben Gvir that showed that a majority of Israelis were in favor of this government, and obviously it started plummeting with the protests over the judicial overhaul, and then took another nosedive after October 7, and has regained somewhat, but not really. He's still, he would lose an election if it was held today. And Netanyahu needs to think, and he is thinking, he's constantly thinking how how to get the deal done in the next election. So for now, it's working, but I don't think it's a long-term strategy. And obviously, he thinks that he can bring something big, shiny achievement to the next election, and that will either be the claim that he has destroyed the Iranian axis, not just Hezbollah. Once again, it wasn't him, but he's taking credit for it. But perhaps a nuclear strike on Iran, or perhaps, sorry, not a nuclear strike, as an Israeli strike on Iran's nuclear program. Perhaps the Americans will at some point.
Or Saudi normalization also. Right.
Or a deal with the Saudis. And I think, that is something that especially a deal with the Saudis, that will almost certainly be the thing that precipitates the next election, because also you have to assume that whatever the price the Saudis will demand, it will be something that a part of Netanyahu's coalition cannot accept, and that will also precipitate the end of this government. So, and also that's probably why Netanyahu is not eager to reach it right now. He's got Trump for almost 4 more years in the White House. Netanyahu and MBS can probably reach it in another year, but that will. I think that the timing of a possible Saudi deal will be intimately connected to the timing of the next election. And Netanyahu will hope that the glory of bringing a deal with the second largest Arab country will give him that.
We'll take him across the finish line once again
for the election, but there's a lot will happen until the next election, whenever it comes.
This is true. Well, in the meantime, Anshel, thank you so much for being with us. This was a great conversation. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Yaakov.
Thank you for joining us on today's episode of the Jewish People's Podcast. As always, we are here Mondays and Thursdays for conversations about the news that matters here in Israel and what's happening behind the headlines. You can find us, as always, where podcasts can be found on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, and, of course, the website of the Times of Israel. Feel free to reach out with comments, questions. My email